Well, grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ and the power of the Spirit. And tonight, our text begins in chapter 11 and verse 12 and runs through the end of chapter 12 itself. I was going to say, no, 11, 12, at the end of 12, right? So this is the beginning of the third section of Hosea. We've had two previous sections. This is the third one, right? The first section was chapters 1 to 3, where we had the primary analogy of what? Hosea and Gomer, right? We had a marriage analogy, right? And in the second section, which runs from chapter 4 to chapter 11, verse 11, which is a long section, but we ended up with a different analogy, not a marital analogy, but a what? Parent-child analogy, right? So the relationship between God and Israel has been compared to a marriage, but it's also been compared to a parent-child relationship. And of course, the point is not that either one of those are literal in one sense, but that they are relational. That this is the sort of relationship God has with Israel, sort of like a marriage and also like a parent. And both of those contained a word of indictment, right? In verse, what is it, chapter 2, the word indictment is used in that first section of Hosea. And then in chapter 4, verse 1, we have God has an indictment, has a controversy, a lawsuit. That's what the word indictment and lawsuit kind of means. And then in chapter 12, verse 1, no, verse 2, chapter 12, we have that same word indictment again. So the three oracles are kind of marshaled out, outlined by that word indictment. There's an indictment in the first section, there's an indictment in the second section, and there's an indictment in the third section. And we begin that third section tonight. And you remember, the first two sections had the same general pattern. You have the indictment or the problem or the controversy. Then you have God's response to that, God's response of judgment, of displeasure. But then you always ended in hope. Chapter 3 ends in hope that there will be a David, the house of David will show up, right? Chapter 11 ends in hope, right? God's not going to give up on Ephraim. God's compassion is so great. He's not going to let go. And the same is true in the third section. We have indictment, and then we have judgment, but then we have hope in chapter 14. So we got a couple of chapters of indictment and judgment, and then in chapter 14, we get to the hope again. So this is sort of a literary recapitulation. We're going to say it again, and then we're going to say it again, and then we're going to say it again. And you can imagine why you might repeat stuff like that. What would be the rationale for all that repetition, for saying it over and over and over? You ever told your teenage child to pick up their clothes, clean their room over and over and over, right? I mean, it's that sort of thing, right? They're not listening. They're not buying into it. They're still acting in ways that are contrary to God's own heart. So you say it again, and then you say it again. And so we get this third section of Hosea, and we're going to say it again. Let's remind ourselves, where Hosea is in this story of God, the story of Israel. Remember that just at the time Hosea begins to prophesy, the prosperous rulers of Israel had a long period of prosperity. There was a long period of prosperity. And this prosperity was true both in the north and the south. Uzziah was king in the south, and Jehoshaphat was king. Is that right? Jehoshaphat. I think that's right. Jehoshaphat was king in the north. And they ruled at the same time. They both ruled about 40 some years, you know. So these were two long ruling kings, and they were prosperous. But as their rule ended, the Assyrian Empire became a threat. It was a threat before, but it began to impinge on Israel and Judah. And that would be around the 740s, 750s, somewhere in that time period. We know that Assyria annexed the first part of Judah, of Israel, the northern kingdom, in around 734 BC. So they just took Galilee, basically, Gilead. They took control, they annexed it, made it part of their empire. They made Samaria the capital of the northern kingdom, submit, pay tribute, you know, they humiliated them. But eventually, Israel was rebelling again. Didn't pay the tribute or looked for other help to Egypt, maybe. And so in 722, 723, 722, the Assyrians came and just annexed the whole northern kingdom and supplanted the whole northern kingdom, took the people out, not everybody, of course, but the leaders and the wealth and the power, the artisans, and they transferred them elsewhere. They moved them to other regions in the world that Assyria controlled. That was one way Assyria kept control of its territory, is it would move one group of people to a new territory and take that people and move them to another, so that you just couldn't have the natural political stability that would enable a revolt, you know, or something like that. So all that was around 720s, right, when the northern kingdom was annexed. And Hosea is probably prophesying still at that time. And Micah is already beginning to prophesy in Judah. So we're in the 700s BC, basically, the last half of the 700 BC. And this is when Assyria is dominating the world, dominating Israel, dominating Aram and other Philistines and others, and forcing Judah to make tribute as well, forcing Judah to pay homage, to do their tribute in order to stay in existence. So this is a time of well, that's a good way of saying it, of oppression, of imperial annexation, what we would call exile. So it's in that context that Hosea, in this last oracle, chapters 12 to 14, basically, speaks to Israel one more time. Collects these oracles together. Maybe they're published in some way. Maybe they're spread around in some way. We just don't know what that looks like or how that would work, really. But presumably, they would be collected in some form to be read in public, be read at gatherings, at festivals, or something of that nature, just like the Torah was, the law was. So let's read Hosea, beginning in chapter 11, verse 12, through the end of chapter 12. The word of the Lord. Ephraim has surrounded me with lies, and the house of Israel with deceit. But Judah still walks with God and is faithful to the Holy One. Ephraim herds the wind and pursues the east wind all day long. They multiply falsehood and violence. They make a treaty with Assyria, and oil is carried to Egypt. The Lord has an indictment against Judah and will punish Jacob according to his ways and repay him according to his deeds. In the womb, he tried to supplant his brother, and in his manhood, he strove with God. He strove with the angel and prevailed. He wept and sought his favor. He met him at Bethel, and there he spoke with him. The Lord, the God of hosts, the Lord is his name. But as for you, return to your God. Hold fast to love and justice, and wait continually for your God. A traitor in whose hands are false balances, he loves to oppress. Ephraim has said, am I rich? Ah, I am rich. I have gained wealth for myself. In all of my gain, no offense has been found in me that would be sin. I am the Lord your God from the land of Egypt. I will make you live in tents again, as in the days of the appointed festival. I spoke to the prophets. It was I who multiplied visions, and through the prophets I will bring destruction. In Gilead there is iniquity. They shall surely come to nothing. In Gilgal they sacrifice bulls, so their altars shall be like stone heaps on the furrows of the field. Jacob fled to the land of Aram. There Israel served for a wife, and for a wife he guarded sheep. By a prophet the Lord brought Israel up from Egypt, and by a prophet he was guarded. Ephraim has given bitter offense, so his Lord will bring his crimes down on him and pay him back for his insults. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let's begin with those first couple of verses here in this section, which kind of, you might say it's kind of a topical paragraph if we had discourse. I mean, this is poetry, but it sets the topic for the rest of chapter 12. And what we have is a contrast between Judah and Ephraim, between Judah and Israel. And we have an identification of Ephraim's problem. What is it that Ephraim is doing and becomes the reason why they're suffering, the reason for their exile ultimately? So when you're looking at those two verses that open our reading, what do we see as Israel's sin? What's identified here?
They lie.
Okay, they're liars. This is the sin of Israel, right? They're liars, deceivers. What else do we see?
They're unfaithful with God.
Okay. Well, in contrast to Judah, right?
So-
Judah is faithful.
So in the NIV, it's saying bad stuff about Judah. It says, in the NIV, it says, and Judah is unruly against God.
But not as bad as Israel.
Well, this is the translation problem.
Uh-huh.
All right. The Hebrew here is uncertain. We don't really know what it means. Okay. So people are making their best guesses about things. So there are two major ways of translating it. One is to say Judah still rules with God or walks with God, or, and the other is that Judah is unruly. Right? So most translations will go with kind of the new RSV, that Judah is walking with God or ruling with God. But that's a big question. It's a question mark. So you're right, Brad. The NIV and a few other translations make it a negative, which makes more sense when you get down to chapter 12, verse 2, when there's an indictment against Judah as well. So it seems like it should be negative, negative. Judah's negative here, negative here. But that rendering is more, without going into all the technicalities, it's more of a fixing. We're going to fix this because it doesn't make sense that it would be positive and then negative, right? So we're going to fix it. And we have this option, but it's a slight option. But you're right. I mean, that's the difference. And your other translations may reflect that as well. But whatever the case is there, faithfulness to the Holy One is part of the criteria here for sure. But when we're looking at verse 1 of chapter 12, what are some of the things that we see there that identify the sin of Israel? Violence. Yeah, we got violence there. And what?
Lies and more lies, multiple.
Oh, yeah, the falsehood. That kind of goes with the lying, doesn't it?
Uh-huh.
So we can just put falsehood up here. So we got, that tells us something. This is a real problem here. I mean, we got this emphasized 3 times, right? A good Hebraic way. Yeah, Barbara.
What does it mean when it says he feeds on the wind? He feeds on the wind and pursues the east wind.
Yeah. Yeah, let me come back to that. That's a good question about beginning of verse 1, that he herds the winds or he pursues the east wind. So yeah, what is that metaphor about? I mean, it's not literally they're chasing the wind, right? They're not out there, chasing. It's some metaphor for something. What could you imagine what that might be a metaphor for?
Would be Assyria and Egypt?
No, I don't think I don't know. This is something Ephraim is doing. Ephraim is pursuing the wind. You say what?
Violence or what?
Okay, yeah, they're chasing after something that involves their sins. But when you chase the wind, what's the ultimate result of that?
Reap the whirlwind.
Yeah. Okay, when you sow and you reap the whirlwind, that's true. That's true. But when you think about Ecclesiastes, it's all just the chasing of the wind. It's meaningless. It's vanity. Yeah, Ephraim's out there working themselves up, right? But in a futile way. There's futility to it. They're not going to gain anything from it, right? It's a chasing after the wind. And so Israel is intent on surviving. They're going to survive as a nation. They're going to pull it together. They're going to work at it. But it's like chasing the wind. It's like herding the wind, like herding cats, right? I mean, it's like shepherding the wind. You can't shepherd the wind. The wind's going to do what the wind does. Right? You can't shepherd it. And so Israel finds themselves in that they're on a merry-go-round. They can't get off. And it ends up being nothing for them because of their sin. So we have this lie, this falsehood, this violence, and there's one more thing in verse 1.
Made a covenant with you.
Oh, yeah. They're political alliances. Remember, this has been a constant theme in Hosea. Instead of trusting God, they tried to fix their lives, fix their situation it says here, oil is carried to Egypt. And you think, well, what's that got to do with anything? Oil carried to Egypt, so what? Well, think about olive oil, one of the big economic, agricultural interests of Judah. They produce a lot of olive oil with olive trees. And when you're doing trading with Egypt, you're trying to buy Egypt off, maybe, right? So you try to buy Assyria off, and then you try to buy Egypt off, and you kind of playing the mouse is playing between 2 cats, right? Kind of thing.
They forgot all about the Lord.
And they forgot, they didn't trust the Lord. They tried to manipulate the situation out of their own interest and out of their own capacity. Right? So this is kind of a summary right here at the beginning. This is the indictment. But then chapter 12, verse 2 is confusing. Because the first line of verse 2 is the Lord has an indictment, a controversy, a prosecution to make against Judah. I said, well, where did that come from? Judah is sometimes referred to in a negative way in Hosea, sometimes referred to in a positive way in Hosea. And if chapter 11 and verse 12 is a positive, here we get a negative. There's an indictment against.
Would it be a warning?
A warning? Yeah. In fact, this same word, indictment, we see in Micah chapter 6 and verse 1. The Lord has an indictment, has a controversy with you. So if Micah's prophesying, Micah is already, he's about, maybe they're parallel here in time, overlapping. So Micah already is prophesying about an indictment of Judah. Maybe, and this is difficult. Some suggest that maybe the form of Hosea that we have now is the form of Hosea that was published in Judah. That is, that this writing addressed to Israel was also then became part of the canon of Judah. So Judah was reading this too. And so if Judah's reading it, maybe Judah is included here as a warning, as a recognition that, hey, Judah, you're not immune. You're not immune. Just because you're Judah, just because you're the house of David, you are not immune. All right. So maybe that's why Judah appears here, because the rest of chapter 12 is all about Israel. It's not about Judah. It's all about Israel. Except we have this, let's think about it this way. You have Judah and Israel, the northern and southern kingdoms, and they both go back to this fellow by the name of what? That's named in our text over and over. Jacob. All right, we got Jacob. And maybe Judah and Israel are both included because the point that Hosea wants to make is that you are all just a cut out of the cloth of Judah. I mean, out of Jacob. You're just like your ancestor. You're like Jacob. Yeah. And that's why we get all these references to Jacob. So maybe, you remember in Deuteronomy, God says, I chose you, not because you were the most numerous, but because you were the fewest. I chose you, not because you are the most faithful. In fact, you're the most stubborn people around, right? Deuteronomy chapter 9. There's this kind of point made in the story of Israel that Israel is a stubborn nation, that they are often hard-hearted. They're stubborn people. And it goes back to Jacob. And Jacob is kind of the story that Israel hears, and they see themselves through the lens of Jacob. So let's pay attention to what he says about Jacob here. So let's look at, there are several incidences. Let's begin there in verse 3. In the womb, he tried to what?
Press his brother's heel.
Press his brother's heel.
Yes.
Grasp his brother's heel. Supplant his brother. Right? So this is about birth, right? Jacob and Esau, twins. And you remember the story, he's grabbing hold of the heel as Esau's coming out. He's already wanting to supplant. He's wanting to take over. He's wanting to be first. He's wanting to overcome the birthright, right, of Esau. And this is the same Hebrew word that's used in Genesis. So Hosea is connecting to that story, both verbally and conceptually. So Israel, you're just like Jacob. You're a supplanter. You're a deceiver. It came from birth. I mean, Israel, this is the way you've been all the way, I brought you out of Egypt through the Red Sea. I bring you to Sinai, and what do? You can't even wait 40 days. And you already got a calf going, right? And we have this constant frustration, even out of Israel's birth. There is the golden calf story, which is the original sin of Israel is the golden calf. So the birth story is still kind of reflecting Israel's origin story, right? Then we have the next one. What's the next incident in Jacob's life?
Struggle with the angel.
Okay, yeah, we got two lines there, right? And in his manhood, he strove with God and he strove with the angel. So this wrestling that happened at the river Jabbok, right? Like Genesis 32. Yeah, I think it's 32. And this is a really identity forming moment in the story of Jacob. You remember, it's important to remember the story here and get the full context. You remember Jacob snuck out from Laban. Right? Laban was his father-in-law who deceived him, just as Jacob had deceived Isaac. So Laban deceives Jacob, and now Jacob's sneaking out of town with his wives and children and flocks and making a run for it. And Laban catches up with him in Gilead, which is going to be important here in a moment. Catches up with him in Gilead. They make a covenant there. Jacob is now headed home, but what's he afraid of? Yeah, afraid of Esau. Afraid of what Esau might say. Yeah.
Yeah, I know you're gonna say something about this. You know, I see in chapter 12 and 13, thing really stood out to me, John Martha. God, he felt about sin.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he couldn't stand it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I thought about that. How does it feel today?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, Jesus, he got angry too.
Yeah. I mean, the Holy One, he's the Holy One, right? So doesn't like deceivers, doesn't like people deceiving each other, or he's the Holy One. He's the truth. Even Jesus is the truth, the way, the life, and the truth. So yeah, I think we still have that sense of holiness is important. It's part of what Hosea is doing. He's testifying about the holy God, right? We even had that phrase, Holy One, here. But when we're looking at this wrestling, it's interesting because here in Hosea, it's a wrestling with God. I think it's also in Genesis 32, because two things are named in Genesis 32 as a result of the wrestling or the striving, struggling with God. Jacob gets his name changed to what? Israel. What does the word Israel mean? One who struggles with God, right? So Israel gets the name, the one who struggles with God, out of that wrestling match. But also there's the name of the place is identified as well. There's a new name for the place that happens. It's called Peniel, which means the face of God. So in Genesis 32, it's God that he's wrestling with, right? And we have that in Hosea as well. He strove with God. But also Genesis 32 says it's a man. It's a human he's struggling with. I mean, it's a physical wrestling match. It's a physical activity. He's wrestling with somebody who has physical form and can hit you and knock you down and touch your hip. And so you walk with a limp the rest of your life. So it's a man as well. But then Hosea says it's also an angel. And he's saying, well, which is it? Right? Which is it? And I think the answer is yes. Yes. Because angel, this is often misunderstood. When we see the word angel, we sometimes think, oh, that's one of those heavenly beings that has the created heavenly being, one of God's servants around the throne. And it may refer to that. But it also, the word angel refers not to their nature or to their ontology or to their being. The word angel refers to their function. One who is sent, a messenger. So the word angel is always about function, not about ontology, not about their nature, right? So what we have here is a divine theophany in the form of a human, which is a messenger from God. Or it might be said that it is God. It's a theophany. It's God appearing. God is appearing in this messenger. This messenger is God. And it brings us to the whole discussion of like, what is the meaning of the angel of Yahweh, the angel of Jehovah, the angel of Yahweh in the Old Testament? And I think it's God's human form. You know, God takes on a human form in order to speak a message or to act in a particular way. And ultimately, that human form is an incarnation in Jesus, right? Jesus becomes incarnate. So I think that what Jacob wrestles with here is God in a human form that is also bringing a message to Jacob, right? God in a human form bringing a message. Now, why does Hosea refer to it, though? Well, he says he wept and sought his favor. If you go back and read Genesis 32, there's no weeping. Yeah, go ahead. Right. It does sound like Jesus, doesn't it? God in human form bringing a message. This is not incarnation in this case, though. Here it's a theophany, that is an appearance of. God appeared as a man and acted in a human form. But the incarnation is when God actually becomes a human being, right? Permanently becomes a human being. So there's a distinction, but yes, there's a connection as well that I think it's legitimate to make that connection, especially if we think of this as the angel of Yahweh, which is perhaps most likely an expression of the second person of the Trinity, the expression of the Logos, the Word, that appears in certain ways. I mean, think about Abraham entertained three angels, but it was actually theophanies, because those angels spoke in the first person as if they were God, right? So it wasn't that these angels were created heavenly beings. It's rather that these men appeared as messengers and were appearing as God in human form. They were God appearing in human form. They're called angels, messengers. I know it's complicated, but that's why, I mean, it's why I try to make sense of that, right? Hosea says God and angel, and Genesis says man and God. So who's right? I think, yeah, they're right. Yes, okay, they're all right. It's not a contradiction. But the point would be something like, we got to speed up here. The point would be, why mention this? I mean, in Genesis 32, this is kind of a good thing that he wrestled with God. He got a blessing out of it, got renamed out of it. But the context is this Jacob trying to manipulate the situation to his own advantage. Remember when he got to the river, he stayed behind alone and sent his wives and children and people to meet Esau first. There you go. That's a good, charming thing to do, right? I mean, very knightly of him, chivalry. Yeah. Hey, let's see what Esau's going to do. If Esau's mad, he'll kill my wife first, and then maybe I can get out of here. Something like that, maybe. So I think that context tells us that this wrestling also had it was part of a larger negative story of how Jacob was trying to manipulate the situation. just like he tried to manipulate the birthright, right? Now, notice in the third thing we have here is Bethel. Remember what happened at Bethel? The angels descending and ascending, had that ladder vision, at Bethel. And Bethel, he names it Bethel because this is where he encountered God, because Bethel means house of God. That's what the word means, house of God. And so he met him at Bethel. Well, think about, I'm going to run out of time here. So I'm going to kind of pull it together a little bit before we run out of that time. So Jacob at Bethel. What happens at Bethel according to Hosea? God speaks, right?
Right.
God speaks. Where did Israel hear God speak? When did that happen? It's Sinai, right? At Mount Sinai. God spoke from the mountain, and then he said, "Oh, we don't want to do that. We don't. Moses, you speak. We don't want to hear God himself, right?" Jacob also experienced this. So there is a real encounter with God, right? There's a real encounter with God. But Jacob's story is one that doesn't listen to God very well. So if we go down a little further to verse 12, we have his flight to Aram. Why did he flee to Aram? Why did he flee, leave home? What was going on? Yeah. He stole the birthright, stole the blessing, deceived his father. Esau wants to kill him. We got a family mess here. Talking about family dysfunction. And this is a family mess. So Israel, you're just like Jacob. You're out for yourself. You're a deceiver. You're a liar. You're like father, like son. You're just like your ancestor. And if you look at, for example, in verse 11, it says, in Gilead there is iniquity. In Gilgal they sacrifice bulls. They sacrifice idolatrously, right? Gilead is up north. When you think about Israel as a nation, Gilead's north and Gilgal is south. So it's kind of like saying, from your northern part of your country to the southern part of your country, you're just full of it, right?
Wicked.
You're full of this sin. Yeah.
Wicked people.
Wickedness, violence, political alliances, violence. It's the leaders primarily he's talking about, but also economic injustice. We can add another sin here, verse 7. Economic injustice. How does that appear in verse 7? The economic injustice. Yeah, dishonest scales. I'm going to cheat you at the weighing so that I get more for less, right? And Esau is described as one who loves to oppress. Because what does Ephraim get out of it?
Money,
Verse 8.
wealth.
Right. They are greedy, right? They get wealth.
They're so greedy, they think they don't have any, they're free from sin.
Yeah, they don't even recognize the sin, right? You can become so powerful and so wealthy and so narcissistic, right, that you don't recognize the evil you're doing. Right? That was true of Ephraim, according to this description. And the Lord's response to that is, I'm the one who brought you out of Egypt, and I'm the one who can send you into tents again. That is, I can send you back into the wilderness. Remember the Feast of Tabernacles, where Israel would live in booths for a week to remember the wilderness experience? That was a festival. That was a time to celebrate. It was a time of gratitude and remembrance. Oh, God brought us through the wilderness, and now we're in the land, but we live in a tent for a week so that we remember what it was like, what our ancestors did. But here in verse 9, God says, I'm going to send you back to tents, which basically says, I'm going to take you out of the land. I'm going to send you back into the wilderness. I'm going to send you into exile, is another way of saying that, right? As you're looking at verse 10 and then verse 13, the prophets. Sometimes the prophets, you listen to the prophets, they'll guide you to life. You don't listen to the prophets, and it will bring destruction. Okay? Who are you listening to? Who are you listening to? Well, let's bring this home a little bit here. Let's go back to verse 6, because I think this is really important. We've talked about the sins, right? But now let's talk about what God's expectation. God is opposed to their sins, to their deceit, their violence, their economic injustice, their political alliances. But in verse 6, we get what God is really interested in, right? As for you, return to your God, or you shall return to your God. You could translate it either way. And hold fast to three things. You're looking at verse 6. What are those
Love,
three things?
justice,
Yeah.
love, justice, and mercy.
Love, justice. The word mercy is translated, you can translate it either way. This is our word, our very important word, hesed, right? That word that you really can't translate very easily into English in one word. Loving kindness, steadfast love, mercy, covenant loyalty, even loving allegiance. It's a covenant word. It's about relationship, hesed. We had that back in chapter 6, verses 4 and 6, when God said, your love is like a morning dew. Shows up for a little while and it goes away. It doesn't hang on. But what God desires, God says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. I desire hesed, not sacrifice.
Could you say that verse 6 is why God made us?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is Israel. Israel was supposed to be a light to the nations, right? They were supposed to image God before the nations. They were supposed to show the nations who God is by how they lived, which goes back to Genesis 1. God created us to be like this. This is what God created us for, right? So love and mercy, justice, and what's the last one? The third one? This one may be translated differently. Say it again.
Wait on God.
Okay, wait on God. Anybody have a different translation than wait? Yeah. You could use trust. You could talk about hope. Those are all possible translations. Think about, we're talking about Micah again, right? Micah chapter 6, verse 8. What does God require of you? And oh man, what God requires of you. Oh mortal, what God requires of you. To love mercy, to do justice, and walk humbly. Same thing here, right? Basically, it's the same message. This is what God expects. This is what God requires. This is what God wants you to be, because it is a reflection of who God is. God doesn't say, return, give me better sacrifices, give me more sacrifices. Doesn't say that. It says, become like me. All right? Become a person who loves mercy, right? Who loves justice, who trusts and walks with God, humbly with God, trusting in God. And not one who loves to oppress. So the contrast between verse 6 and verse 7, you have this great injustice in verse 7. You have this loving in verse 7, but this loving in verse 7 is a love of oppression and a love of greed. Yeah.
This, love you talk about, this, Jesus showed what the love was, because he said that if you've seen me, you've seen the Father.
Yeah.
So they both were in agreement with
Yeah. You've seen me, you've seen the Father. Jesus demonstrates what love is, right? Yeah, exactly. He tells us to love God and love neighbor, right? Which is exactly, this is another way of saying that, right? To love mercy, to do mercy, to do justice, and to walk with God and wait on God. Walk with God or wait on God, same sort of thing, same idea. To live in step with God. Because it's about reflecting who God is in our lives. And the problem with Israel was not just a few mistakes, right? A few wrong turns. The problem with Israel was that in their heart, they were not reflecting who God is in their lives. And that's what brings on the destruction, the self-destruction. So if you look at the last verse in our reading, verse 14, Ephraim has given bitter offense. So the Lord will bring his crimes down on him and pay him back for his insults.
Responsible for their sins.
Responsible for their sins. And their sins have their own consequences. Right? And notice how it's characterized that the sins are an offense and an insult to God. God says, you're my child, Be like your father, be like your parent. You're my child. But they don't want to be the child of God. They want to pursue their own interests. And when they pursue their own interests, they're trying to herd the wind. They're trying to chase the wind. And that's futile. You can't get anywhere that way. Yeah.
There's a truth for us, John Mark, that the only sin that can't be forgiven is one if we don't confess.
Yeah. I mean, if we don't recognize our sin and we don't confess sin and we don't seek to turn our heart toward God, yeah. That's a dead end, right? It ends in destruction. It's a chasing after the wind. It's a trying to herd the wind. And that's what Ephraim was doing. So this was the indictment. I think we see the contrast between the indictment of the sin and God's desire for the people. That if the people would return to God by love, by embracing steadfast love, embracing justice, and trusting God, it would be a different outcome. But when you choose violence, you die with violence, don't you? When you choose the sword, you die by the sword. And that's what Israel did. They didn't choose God, they chose the sword. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with us all. Amen.